got here very fortunate to have Associate Professor Andrew Scott from Deakin University, who's a visiting fellow here at the Nordic European and EU Centre, and who has kindly agreed to give a presentation on his topic of expertise, social policy in Europe. He's writing a book now on the lessons that social policy in Nordic countries could have for Australia, and that's what he's come to do with us here. It's a bit fast, I believe. But he's taken up the time to come and give the session, so please give a round of applause. It's on.
Thank you, Alfonso, and I'm glad to be here. I do want to talk today about what I see as a significant and wide variety within Europe, that vast continent, which is used, the term Europe is used somewhat loosely. And the EU, of course, is important. So too are national governments, and the historical differences between countries of Europe in many ways still persist, despite all the achievements of confederation in the EU, and despite those policy-making bodies that Alfonso was talking about earlier, the supranational bodies like the EU, European Parliament, and so on. My area of interest particularly is the Nordic nations, Scandinavia, sometimes called Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland. Finland comes in as a Nordic country, but not as a Scandinavian one. Now, Finland is a country that used to be very economically entangled with Russia, or the former Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, Finland's economy was hit both by that and by the international economic recession of the early 1990s. And yet since that time, Finland has had a remarkable achievement in rebuilding itself and becoming a different kind of country. And it stands out in contrast with its neighbours. Largely, Finland has adopted a Scandinavian strategy that has followed the model of Sweden and Norway in having a high welfare spending, high taxing, egalitarian approach. And yet, despite that, which you would think, from what I've just said, those areas of policy more associated with the left of politics, Finland has popped up right at the top of a whole lot of international comparisons of economic competitiveness and of educational performance. Now, the first slide I want to show you is this page from the Global Competitiveness Index. And Finland, as you see, is number 3 in the latest ranking. And if you go across to look at some of the components of this, Finland, in the terms of innovation and sophistication factors, is number 2. Switzerland is number 1. Now, this is not just European countries that have been compared here, but the thing I find most interesting is you have to go a very long way down the list to find a southern European country. You see a lot of northern European countries at the top of this list. Switzerland is one, Finland is another, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, the UK. Now, the UK is a bit different, of course. Is it European or is it not? Margaret Thatcher would turn in her grave if we declared it just a province of the continent. In some ways it's European, in some ways it's not. It has the distinction of being both a sort of European country, but also part of the English-speaking family of nations. And the English-speaking family of nations have characteristics all of their own. Norway is up there. Now, having Norway, with its 78% resource profits tax on oil, is so high on an international ranking of economic competitiveness, done largely by market liberal economists. That to me is very interesting, because Norway, unlike Australia, uses its natural resource wealth to benefit the whole country. It has a 78% profits tax, which is considerably larger than the attempted super profits mining tax, which was sought to be brought in by the former Martin and Gillard Labor governments, but which was defeated by a very strong campaign by private sector mining companies, led by people like Gina Reinhardt, Clive Palmer, and so on. And yet it seems possible in Norway, despite their much higher taxation, to have an economically successful country and one in which it's still possible for corporations to make a profit. Not the same scale of profit as the billionaires are in Australia, but a lot of the money from that North Sea oil wealth, in Norway's case, is being put into the massive sovereign wealth fund and used to invest in public education, making all higher education free in Norway, and so on. In Britain, which also had access to North Sea oil in the Thatcher years, the money, the proceeds were given in personal income tax cuts, including to those who arguably did not necessarily need it, and were spent on designer goods and so on. Consumption. Some people would argue, and I'm one of them, that Norway actually took a more prudent and long-term constructive policy approach to using its resource wealth. So it interests me that Norway is there, it interests me that Denmark's there. Denmark is there partly because of its policy of flexicurity. Has anyone heard the term flexicurity before? No? Okay. As the term suggests, flexicurity is an attempt to bring together two concepts. One is flexibility, the other is security. And these are often put in opposition. Employers often say they want flexibility from workers to be available all the time. How many of you have worked in part-time jobs? Those two. Have you been called in for shifts at short notice? Many of you have. Has that been inconvenient to your family lives or personal lives? Has. That's the kind of flexibility that employers see. Flexibility that workers might see, particularly those who are old enough to be parents, and I am, might be more predictability of working hours and knowing that you can leave on a regular basis at 3:30 to pick up your child from school, or 5 from childcare. Security is seen as very important in the Nordic countries. The attitude there seems to be that before you can have economic change, you have to have security. People are not going to embrace economic change, globalisation, new possibilities if they feel threatened and insecure. If they feel, however, that they have some certainty in their lives, then they are more likely to look at change favourably. Flexicurity is an attempt to bring those two different concepts together. And what the Danes do, what they do in Denmark, is they don't say we'll give you job security, but they do say we'll give you employment security. That is, if you lose your current job, such as the manufacturing and car manufacturing workers are in Australia, we don't guarantee you'll get another job in the car industry, but we do guarantee we will spend a lot of money and time investing in retraining you with high quality skills to improve your prospects of getting another job. Flexicurity, this has attracted interest from other parts of Europe, although there's some concern in Denmark that parts of the flexicurity triangle are being touted in other parts of Europe without other parts, that the flexibility part is being touted, the idea of employers being free to hire and fire is being touted, but not the same money investment in skills retraining that is an essential corner of that triangle. Now, I mentioned loose talk about Europe. We hear it in Australia a lot actually. Joe Hockey, the Treasurer of Australia, says, oh, we're not going to be like Europe. But as you can see, Europe's got a fairly diverse set of countries in terms of this measure, economic competitiveness. Where can we find a southern European country? If you go right down the list, I think Spain comes in at about 40 or something. 35, oh, spotted it.
Don't put us down that much.
Oh, you're Spanish. Gosh, you can say, oh, we'll find that. But you're on the higher southern European. Italy is further down at 50, I think, and so on. So these are not, Portugal is lower. These are also well regarded in terms of competitiveness. But one of the points I enjoyed reading from Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning American economist, who writes regularly about Europe. He writes in the New York Times. He was getting very sick of the fact that in America, people say, look, the Eurozone currency crisis just shows you what happens when you spend too much on welfare. Without ever shooting. Well, he pointed out, actually, it's the other way around. The countries that are doing well in Europe are those that spend more on welfare. The countries that are doing badly are those that spend less. Germany is a star performer, he said, and Sweden actually has higher GDP after the global financial crisis of 2008-2009 than before. So Paul Krugman argued that problems of the Eurozone currency do not say anything about the sustainability of welfare states. They may, however, say something about the Eurozone currency crisis, may say something about the virtue of some small countries being able to maintain and control their own currencies. This is another interesting thing about the Nordic nations. They're half in Europe and they're half out. They're in the EU, but they haven't adopted the euro currency. Germany, of course, has. Germany is big enough to cope with currency fluctuations, even on the scale that the euro has been having. Sweden, Denmark and Norway have all kept their own currency, different forms of the krona. Finland has joined the euro. But we know, for example, in Australia, debates about the currency. We keep hearing we had the 30th anniversary of Paul Keating, the former Labor Treasurer's decision to float the Australian dollar, deregulate the Australian dollar, stop government control of the level of our currency in Australia. He was wheeled into the Labor caucus to say what a brilliant man he was and what a brilliant decision it was. On virtually the same day that the whole car industry announced it was closing Australia, which of course has been followed by Toyota. Sweden still has a car industry. Germany still has a car industry. I'm not saying you have to have a car industry to be successful in the world, Switzerland does, as far as I know. But if you have a car industry, you need to have some control of your currency. Sweden supports its car industry with more money than Australia has supported its. And the Swedish car company that I'm referring to is, of course, Volvo, a very different brand of car. Not always seen as the most fashionable car, the old forms of Volvo, but always regarded as very safe and still regarded as very safe. Not like Qantas that used to be regarded as safe and now is a bit dicey. Volvo has been seen as a very innovative company. Part of the Scandinavian experiments with teamwork, industrial democracy. The exact opposite of the Ford assembly line invented by Henry Ford, whereby you get workers lined up, each doing exactly the same boring task over and over and over again. Instead, Volvo brought in innovations in the 70s and 80s to get all members of the car-making team contributing to the overall making of the car and getting a concept of what they're making, which is actually somewhat more satisfying work. If you're more satisfied with work, maybe you're more likely to be productive, which may be one of the reasons that these countries are higher on the competitiveness list than Australia is. Now, there's long been a debate about varieties of capitalism. Is that a term you want to say, varieties of capitalism? I'm introducing you have. It's relevant to your studies. It depends exactly what topic you're doing, but the main names in the varieties of capitalism literature are Peter Hall and David Soskice, S-O-S-K-I-C-E. They emphasise the difference between coordinated market economies like Germany and liberal market economies like America. And they argue that both have some strengths and both have some weaknesses. But one of the strengths the coordinated market economies have, typically in Northern Europe, is that they value vocational skills, not just academic learning. They don't regard vocational trades type jobs as culturally inferior. And that gives them some benefits in terms of having a manufacturing industry. Germany has probably come out of the global financial crisis better than, well, it definitely has come out better than Britain and America. And probably one of the reasons for that is that it has a manufacturing industry, which is still exporting those quality cars, Mercedes, Audis, BMWs and so on. We do see Swedish cars and buses, we certainly see German cars, BMWs, those who can afford them and so on Australian roads. We also have, next time you have a look at the bus you're getting on, just have a look at the front, you probably see it's got Scania or Volvo on it, maybe a Mercedes. Why is this small country, Sweden, 9 million people, making these huge buses and trucks, firing them and so on, and exporting all the way from the other side of the world to Australia and doing so profitably? It's a good question. Maybe it knows something about its economic approach which we could learn, and other European countries could learn something from. Now we'll go to another slide. And this is in some ways the opposite of competitiveness, it's about equality. How clear is that for you at the back? Can you see it right? Okay, now this is an OECD chart, fairly recent data, showing the extent to which countries differ in terms of the economic inequality within the distribution of income. And again, we see clustered at the lower end of inequality, Northern European countries, Iceland, Northern and Eastern European countries, Iceland, Slovenia, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Slovak Republic, Austria, Sweden, Luxembourg. Luxembourg is a country you only ever hear about using statistical comparisons. Hungary, now we're still looking for a Southern European country here. I'm up to getting halfway through the chart. Italy, sorry, they picked you that time. They're less like, I'm assuming, of course, that equality is a desirable. Many people say it's not necessarily desirable. Spain's over here, Greece is over here. So Greece, Italy, and Spain, and Portugal rank low in terms of economic competitiveness and high in terms of economic inequality. That seems to me to be undesirable for a number of reasons. Why might more equal countries do better economically? It's a strong research interest of mine, and it's the conundrum to orthodox economics that's continuing to be presented by the Nordic countries. The argument is that countries that are more equal and cooperate internally are more likely to be effective in competition internationally. That is, there's more cooperation, constructive engagement, participation in the workforce, and common cause for the difficult task of surviving in the modern global economy. This seems to be the evidence that equality may be good for economic performance. Now, obviously, some countries can perform well. America, we know, is the world superpower, but its inequality is approximately what this right-hand scale shows is the amount the top 10% of income earners get compared to the bottom 10%. In America, they get about 18 times what the bottom 10% do. In Norway, they get less than 10. The yellow dot, sorry, it's more like a 5. I have to get a rule for the right across. But as you can see, America more than 3 times as unequal as Norway and most of the other Nordic and Northern European countries. Now, despite that inequality, America is a powerful country, it's a military power, and all of that. But we know there's a great deal of social problems in America because of inequality. Racial problems, problems of violence, problems of missed opportunity for those who don't get to participate in the workforce and so on. Equalities can also relate to gender, women and men. And I'm next going to show a slide about child poverty. And the Nordic nations are fairly well known for high levels of gender equality. That is, feminism has made more advances in the Northern European countries than in the Southern European countries. Now, how are we going for visibility here? Looking at some more. I need to bring this up. Can you see the country names there? Yes or no? Good, thank you. Okay, so this is done by the United Nations Children's Fund, and the reason some countries aren't in some charts is not because they're being excluded because they don't fit the story, but sometimes just the data doesn't allow. This is a comparison of child poverty rates both before and after the effect of government taxes and transfers. So child poverty, if there was no welfare state, in Finland would be 15.2%. The effect of the universalist welfare spending in Finland is to reduce child poverty by 1/3. So the light blue bar is child poverty before government taxes and transfers and payments. The darker blue bar is after. So Finland child poverty is cut to around 5%. Netherlands and all European countries as well. Sweden substantially cut, Denmark substantially cut. Most countries actually, it is substantial, even in Britain. And that may be because, maybe because the Blair government and Gordon Brown as Treasurer or Chancellor in the Blair government did put some emphasis on reducing child poverty. Even in Britain, which is not as universal a welfare state by any means as the Nordic countries, child poverty is reduced from 26.4% to 14.6% by the effective government actions, which would include the National Health Service. However, it is still at 14.6% after government taxes, nearly 3 times that of Finland. Then we come down to the Southern European countries. Sorry, Alfonso, but not only do they have high rates of child poverty before government taxes, they have them after government taxes. Here, this is where it's most obvious that the effective government activity does little to reduce child poverty in these Southern European countries. So this seems to me to be a lot to do with national government provision of welfare and taxation policies, and what a difference it still makes in Europe. Children, why might child poverty be lower in the Nordic countries? Sweden is the country that led the way in reducing child poverty. And one of the arguments for this, and this brings us back to some of the historic attributes of Europe which still persist and influence policy today, is the religious differences between the countries. Now, what religion are these 3 countries? Catholic, I think it's true to say Portugal is Catholic.
Yeah.
Even in Spain, we know it is. Catholic countries. What religion are the Scandinavian and these other Northern European countries? Protestant. Can we be any more specific about Sweden?
Sweden's Lutheran.
Lutheran, thank you. If Greece was on here, what religion would that be? Orthodox, thank you. So, we have this different religious history in Europe that they're all Christians, of course. Happy family. All think Jesus was not only good, he was the Son of God and so on. But Lutheranism is a rather different Christian religion than Catholicism, particularly when it comes to matters like attitudes towards families. And with Catholics, the Catholic Church still teaches doesn't allow women priests, doesn't countenance homosexuality. It probably is associated still with traditional patriarchal values. And that includes the old maxim, children should be seen and not heard. Children should be obedient in families. Now, the thing about the Lutheran religion is that it does not influence government in Sweden. Although most Swedes and other Scandinavians are nominally Lutheran, their religion does not influence their attitude, major policy issues, and the government is not influenced by cardinals or their equivalents in the Lutheran Church. And the argument put by a very distinguished Swedish scholar, Goran Thurborn, is that this meant that principles of egalitarianism, including gender equality, and the rights of individuals, including children, advanced much quicker in those Nordic countries than in the Southern European countries. The legal system was less influenced by patriarchal traditional religious values, and therefore the idea of children being individuals in their own right, not only being allowed to be seen and heard, but to have protection and so on, including protection from their parents if necessary, advanced very quickly. One of the policies that Sweden led the world in was to ban physical punishment of children. I'm old enough to have gone to school when you could still get the cane. And I did get the cane. Once or twice I got the ruler on the hand. And I witnessed teachers hitting students. Now, hopefully none of you have ever seen that. But it was still legal, even I think until the 1980s in Victoria, for corporal punishment, physical punishment of children to be done in schools. That was then abolished, a bit old-fashioned and barbaric, but it's not illegal for parents to hit their children in Australia or in most countries in the world. Sweden decided in 1979 that it was going to make it illegal for a parent to hit a child. And that didn't just mean a serious assault, it meant any physical reputation. Smack on the wrist, smack on the bum, whatever, no, it's illegal. Doesn't mean that if someone did that, they'd be thrown into jail for life. But it did mean that there'd be some support to give them parenting ideas about alternative discipline methods. And it's based on the principle, actually, when you look at the logic, it's not a bad principle, I think, is that we're not allowed to assault anyone in our society, anyone at all, except the most vulnerable, the smallest. Sure, it's okay, give them a bit of a belting if you're their parent, if you know best. Well, I find that actually abhorrent. But we still need to hold that. Many countries still follow that policy. Sweden abolished it in 1979, and there is evidence that the rate of child homicides fell dramatically. As a result, because most child homicides, and we've had a terrible case in Victoria actually recently, Luke Deakin, a child murdered by his father. And clearly there's a lot of factors involved there. Mental illness and all sorts of things, failure to enforce intervention orders and so on. But unfortunately, the reality is most child homicides do start out as fatal abuse by parents. They're in the home environment, perhaps step parents and so on. If you prevent any violence, you're less likely to have that violence become having a tragic consequence. Of course, tragic consequences may not just include death, but they may include psychological damage. Children who feel scared, their parents become depressed and anxious, maybe as a result of those experiences. So I think that's relevant. The idea of children being seen as individuals in their own right, having rights from the time they're born. Another factor in the Nordic countries is that they have what is called a dual earner support policy. That is, they're based on the norm that both mothers and fathers work. Women work, and women usually work in full-time jobs, not necessarily as part-time jobs. Australia, we still have what is called a 1.5 breadwinner role. That is, we expect the male to be working and his wife, in the traditional notion of family, to be working, yes, but part-time, she's there for the kids and so on. Now, this is actually not good for women's financial position, and it's not good for children. Children are better off having both parents working in terms of income. What Sweden does is that it encourages full-time work as a norm. It regulates the working hours so they're not excessive. Parents actually have a right, when their children are at primary school, to leave work early in order to pick up their kids from childcare. And the other big factor, of course, is paid parental leave. It's very, very substantial. Sweden, when the child is born, the parents now have 480 days paid parental leave. So that's a year and 15 months possible. And it's parental leave, not maternity leave. That is, a minimum of those 2 months, minimum of those 15 or so months, 2 months minimum must be taken by the fathers. And this has been a policy that has been phased in, basically trying to increase the extent of involvement by fathers in their children's upbringing. And this is quite a radical policy. There's actually a good article on the Age yesterday about Sweden and paternity leave. People are paid 80% of their salary for a year while they're on parental leave, and there's been a significant rise in paternity leave, although it's still not equality. We're not saying that the Nordic countries have achieved utopia or abolished patriarchy or abolished gender inequalities, but they've certainly reduced them much more than many other countries have. Now, of course, we've got paid parental leave in Australia. Now, one of the reasons many people were surprised when Tony Abbott announced that he was going to increase, we're the second last rich country in the world to get a paid parental leave scheme. America's still with that one. We finally got one under the Labor government, but it's only for 18 weeks. It's only the minimum wage. It's basically maternity leave. There is a couple of weeks of dad and partner pay, which is a nice thing, dad and partner. It's dad good. But not very substantial. People were very surprised when we finally got this in Australia after a very long campaign by feminists, by trade unionists, by children's advocates, all sorts of people, like breastfeeding advocates and so on, because breastfeeding is better for young children, and it's more likely to go for the necessary time and health requirement terms if the mother has some serious time off from work to attach to the baby and so on. And Tony Abbott of all people suddenly came out and said, I'm going to go better than that. I'm going to give you 6 months paid parental leave at the higher rate, and we're going to have more paternity leave. I was, hang on, isn't he Cardinal Pell's Catholic mate? Isn't he a bit of a patriarch? Isn't he a misogynist? He's not. Why is he doing this? Now, I can't get inside his head, but I suspect it was, forgive me if I sound cynical, but I suspect it was politically motivated, perceptions of him as being a misogynist, and Paul Rady is not being so hot with the professional female demographic. He was a good chance to do something that looked like he might be more sympathetic there. His party isn't quite so excited about the idea of SIDS. The Social Conservatives in the party don't like it. They prefer the idea of a stay-at-home mum. The market liberals in the Liberal Party don't like it because they don't like the idea of business having to pay for people to have time off. That's objectionable. But one of the interesting things about paid parental leave in the Nordic countries is the longer time you give, the more likely it is that people will come back to the workforce. Workforce participation rates are much higher in the Nordic countries than in countries that have less welfare. So, I mean, a right-wing view, if you like, of welfare would be, if you go to your welfare, at least have lunch. But the evidence is actually that the more welfare you give, the less likely they are to lunch. Now, it's not quite as simple as that. I mean, there are still requirements, there's obligations and so on to receive welfare. You have to be meeting tests and so on. But the evidence seems to be that if women, and to some extent men, are given time off when they most need it, which is clearly around the birth of a child, then they appreciate it. They come back to work when they've had that time. And their skills are not lost. The business actually benefits too, because they get back their experienced worker, they don't have this constant turnover. Another factor in all of this is the early childhood arrangements in the Nordic countries, which are expansive public early childhood education and care. And the acronym for that, you were talking about Eurospeak earlier, every field of policy likes to have a few acronyms. People throw them around to show that they know what they're talking about. ECEC, Early Childhood Education and Care. Now, why is this term used? It's because childcare is not the same as preschool. We know that in Australia. You'll be familiar in most countries. Childcare, the idea in this country is that somewhere you put your kid to be minded for a while, where you have to do something else. Kindergarten or preschool is their initial learning stage before they go to primary school. Yet, what if, and there is considerable evidence which shows that children going into childcare is actually important education. Because this is their first contact with their social contact with other kids. This is the way they make sense of the world from a very early age. Therefore, the quality of that care becomes important. And perhaps it's wrong to separate childcare from education, because education is in fact occurring, even if it's sometimes informal in childcare environments. So the idea is to have early childhood education and care as an integrated approach. This is something that the OECD is supporting. In Australia, we have a bit of a problem with it because we have our federal system. Our federal system says that the national government is responsible for childcare, but the state governments are responsible for preschools and kindergartens. And of course, then you have all the RGOG, the annual Council of Australian Government conferences, where the states are screaming they haven't been given enough money, and the national government says, yes, you have, you're just not spending it right. And they all blame each other. The blame game is called federalism, not terribly helpful, perhaps, in that sense. Our constitution's out of date with realities. Early childhood education and care, kindergartens, and the fact that when the parents return to work, in large numbers that they do after their 12, 15 months of paid parental leave in the Nordic countries, their children often start going to preschools from the age of 1 or 2. Preschools, or early childhood education and care, not for the whole day, but for some hours of the day. And they get into that environment earlier, and this seems to be good for children and their development. And one of the things is that the early childhood workers, who could perhaps be classified as teachers, but perhaps be classified as minders, notice things about kids. They actually see kids more often than doctors do, for example. Some become very perceptive about kids, and they tend to notice developmental or behavioural problems of children earlier, pick them up. And for that reason, they're very, very highly regarded in Sweden. And they're regarded as important source of information. Now, that's one of the reasons why Australia in recent times has moved towards having a requirement for a minimum of 15 hours kindergarten access for all Australian children provided by a university qualified early childhood teacher. To try and get away from the idea that childcare simply means you leave, drop the kid off in the morning, and if the kid's still there at the end of the day, drop the car. Have them run onto Dandenong Road, fall under a bus, successful outcome. But what if the child has had a miserable time, isn't mixing well, and so on? Do you have the quality workers who are being paid enough and valued enough to pick up those and pass them on to people? So child poverty is affected by these things. It's affected by public, affordable, high-quality early childhood education and care, which are highly regarded in the Nordic nations. It's affected by workforce participation. Indeed, Australia's not in this chart because the data wasn't available for comparability, but Australia's child poverty rate is about 12.5%. And according to one notable economist in Australia, or analyst, Peter Whiteford, if you actually reduce the joblessness rate in Australia to the same level as the OECD average, and particularly if you reduce it to the same level as the Nordic European countries, you cut child poverty in Australia to more like 7%, from 12 to 7%. Because joblessness means neither parent works. So Australia has a particularly high proportion of people, households in which neither parent works. So there's a stubbornly unequal segment of people, and if neither parent is working, then that's a very bad environment for childhood, both financially and also socially, in terms of horizons, career, aspirations, planning, and so on. And a suite of policies which emphasise more paid parental leave and early childhood education and care and workforce participation could help that. Now, one of the concerns about Mr Abbott's conversion, religious-like conversion, zealot attitude to paid parental leave is that in order to afford it, because he also knows to have a nice budget surplus, he might cut early childhood education and care, which would be a bit counterproductive. Yeah, what's the point of having the time off with the child, giving a good start for the first 6 months if there's no decent facilities for the child to then become educated? Well, we'll see. I don't want to make any political comments on the foreign one, I suppose. It's got to be completely objective. Although academics do have some freedom to say this. I think we still have. Now, speaking of education, speaking of valuing early childhood teaching and other forms of teaching, this is a chart from a book called The Spirit Level. Anyone heard of that book, The Spirit Level? Richard Wilkinson and Kate Deakin. How visible is that for you? It needs to be a bit clearer. Now, the Spirit Level subtitle of the book is Why Equality is Better for Everyone. Again, looks at inequalities and relates them to other things. And this is one chart from it, seeking to establish relationships there may be between inequality and educational achievement. Now, the interesting thing about this chart, again we see Greece, Portugal and Italy and Spain, high in inequality and low in educational achievement. This is according to international tests of school. The country right up at the top is Finland, at the time this data was done. Finland is highest in educational achievement and almost the lowest. Japan is another case, not a European case, obviously. Why would this be so? Why might Finland be doing so well with education and is it related to being economically more equal? Well, I'm going to show some further slides now from a Finnish visitor to Australia, an expert on their system of education. His name is Pasi Salberg. He's written a book called Finnish Lessons. that visible to you? Finish lessons. What can the world learn from educational change in Finland? And one of the points he makes is that, first of all, Finland got to the top not by trying to get to the top. We often hear statements like, we're going to have the best school system in the world, from Australia, Britain, America. Politicians like to make that to the claim. In Finland, they didn't set out to be the best in the world. They said, we're going to have a good school in every community for all the children all the time. They set forth for equality. Good schools for everyone. The result of that quality was excellence. So this seems to be the very interesting Finnish lesson, which is why many people are looking at Finland as a model for education. Not competition amongst kids, not map plan tests and league tables and so on, not massive funding differences between rich private schools and their local state school. Another thing is that actually they have less homework, less classroom time, more time for play, more time for reflection. It's not actually about inculcating information and seeking that to be regurgitated through 3-hour exams, but rather learning and taking risks, learning from mistakes. That is, if you try something that doesn't work, you're actually more likely to learn something from that than if you get it right the first time. And that is one of the Finnish lessons, and I recommend the book to emphasis on collaboration, trust. And trust here refers particularly to teachers. Teachers are trusted. Teachers are not vilified. They're not constantly forced to comply with performance criteria and so on. They're actually respected. But another part of that is that they are very highly qualified. This shows that it's very hard to get into teaching in Finland. The proportion of applicants compared to those accepted at the University of Helsinki for primary teacher education in 2012, the proportion of accepted is very small. In other words, it would have a very high ATAR if we translate that to the Victorian scene. It's actually hard to be a teacher in Finland than it is to get into medicine, because teaching is well regarded. And most, in fact, all teachers there are required to have a master's degree in Finland. So they support high quality entry requirements for teachers, and then they say, we trust you to go back to business. We know you see the kids every day. We, bureaucrats, academics, business people, politicians, don't see what you see. We will give you flexibility in your school environment to make decisions according to your professional expertise. This seems to get some good outcomes. The curriculum is not a political football. In Australia, we have Christopher Pyne, new Education Minister, immediately overhauling a national curriculum that's hardly started. Collaboration is more important than competition. That's one of the Finnish lessons from Pasi Sahlberg. Trust in teachers rather than forcing them to be accountable. Another. Professionalism rather than bureaucracy. Enhance equity by managing choice. That is, choice can be made within an equitable framework. That is, if kids want to do vocational studies, and in fact many do in Finland, they can do that. But that doesn't mean that they're cut off from the possibility of returning to a more academic pathway. It's not second class. If they're musically talented, they can do that, all within a state school system. If they're good with their hands, if they're sporty, whatever their talents, they can do that. They do it within an equitable framework. And gender equality is another key aspect of the Finnish lessons. So that's the book by Pasi Sahlberg, which I do recommend. Now, one other chart, which is a bit quirky, this one, but I'll put it up anyway. This is also from the Spirit of Law. It seeks to postulate that there is a relationship between equality and environmental responsibility. This suggests that countries which recycle more are more economically equal. And again, Spain, have you been recycling your bottles? Italy, Australia too. Unequal countries, low in this comparison of recycling.
Come to Australia to tell my housemates to recycle. Spain.
Well, maybe the real recyclers in Spain are leaving. Excellent. Sweden is right up there. Germany is also very high. Switzerland again. Now, why might more equal countries be more likely to recycle, or perhaps recycling is part of being environmentally responsible? Feel free to answer that question. I think it's to do with social capital, if you like. It's to do with, if you're in a more egalitarian country, you're more likely to have regard for others, perhaps. You're more likely to be concerned about the effects of your actions. Germany is actually very well regarded environmentally for a number of reasons. Now, again, I mentioned the mining tax in Australia compared to the waste resource tax. I mean, the advertising campaign against the idea of mining tax make it seem that if you support the mining tax, then you're a racist, because there's all these multicultural people working in the mining industry. You're a terrible person. Similarly, the carbon tax. I mean, the carbon tax. The idea of Australia having a carbon tax, biggest in the world, ridiculous, terrible, and shocking. Unfortunately, Europe, as you know, even Britain, have carbon tax. Most countries in the world have it. Even Britain. I say even Britain because I'm thinking of Britain as being a bit. Britain was reluctant to be in the EU for the opposite reason for Sweden and Norway. Norway didn't join the EU. Sweden didn't adopt the euro. Britain joined, but didn't adopt the euro. Britain didn't join because people like Margaret Thatcher thought Europe, the people in Brussels were a bunch of socialists trying to tell her and her free market Brits who won the war after war, don't forget the war. Germany hadn't got the war, and British Conservative Party too. And they were going to be told by these bureaucrats in Brussels what to do. Sweden and Norway and Denmark were reluctant to join the EU for the opposite. They thought, we're going to have our high, egalitarian, welfare state and social policies dragged down to this common denominator with these bloody countries like Britain. And worst of all, we're not going to be one of the three C's. Now, what's one of the three C's? We're not going to be conservative, we're not going to be capitalist, we're not going to be Catholic. We're not going to be socially conservative, we're not going to have more inequality, we want to keep our Nordic model. That was the attitude, that's why the Nordic countries are half in and half out. Norway's not in the middle of the EU. And Norway's probably the richest country in the world, so I think it's doing it right. But then perhaps you could say it's been a bit isolationist, maybe sharing its expertise. Environmentalism, well, Germany is doing well in the sense that, well, carbon taxes started in Finland in 1990. So the idea that Australia in 2010 or 2011 was, going way out in front of the world with the carbon tax was just bullshit. Embedded, you'd say, the tactic. Finland started it, Sweden continued it, Germany has got it, and it hasn't killed their countries, it hasn't killed their industries, hasn't killed their airlines, hasn't killed their car industries, in the case of Germany and Sweden. Germany, of course, with its manufacturing orientation, has also been a world leader in solar power, even though Germany is not a particularly sunny place. I'm sure Australia, with its Gold Coast, or perhaps Spain, with its images of beaches, Mallorca, places like that, could harness some of that natural sunlight and better climate if it had a manufacturing orientation and produce solar power and renewable energy technologies. So I guess it comes back to this diversity within Europe and the need to be sensitive to that and to take that into account while you're studying the EU and its policy role. And perhaps one of the things the EU is doing is trying to take best practice from various parts of Europe and spread them to others. And it's an ongoing project. I think I've said it